Hello, and welcome to Module 2 of this Trauma-Informed Community Coach Training. I'm Susan Klumpner, and I'm here again with Dr. Mays Imad, neuroscientist and national expert on trauma-informed education. In the last class, you were introduced to the complexity of trauma and the contextual factors that lead to incidents of trauma. Today, we will be discussing how the body's stress response system works and how the experience of trauma can affect youth development and behavior. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to distinguish between good and bad stress and identify both common and misplaced responses to trauma and stress triggers. This knowledge will help you interpret youth behavior so you can better decide how to respond to challenging on-court situations. So back to you, Dr. Mays.
Thank you. Hi, Susan.
Nice to see you again. And so I was thinking that maybe we could start talking about what's the function of a healthy brain?
Yeah. So I like the question. I like that there is a lot of power in knowledge, and understanding can help us have compassion for ourselves and others. So I tell the students that the brain is all about survival. Unlike other organ systems, so the kidneys, for example, they are filtering the blood. They are getting rid of waste. The brain is overseeing everything. It receives information from the body. It sends information to the rest of the body. So we have one brain, and that brain is composed of 100 billion neurons. And those neurons, they have 100 trillion connections, synapses. Now, when we're born, the cells, the neurons are all there. They're all there. It is those connections that are not fully assembled and intact. So when you look at the brain and how the brain develops, we could categorize, or we could divide the brain into discrete structures. There is or regions rather. There's a region that deals with our survival, our instinct. That is the brainstem. That region starts developing first, and it makes sense. This is the part that's going to regulate our heart rate, our breathing, and so on. And then there is the second region, which is in the middle of the brain, and that region is the emotional brain, or the limbic system. That also deals with our survival. Emotions are so critical for our survival. And so that's the part of the brain that asks questions: am I loved? Do I belong? And then there is the more complex system, the cortex, or the prefrontal cortex, and that system deals with problem solving. It deals with motivation, it deals with learning, it deals with tasks and imagination, and so on. Now, as I mentioned, when we are born, we have all of the neurons, but we don't have those connections intact. So brain development continues until late 20s. And what's happening there is we're forming more connections. We're also fine-tuning and getting rid of other connection. So if you look at a synaptic structure of someone who is at birth, someone who's in their 20s, and someone who's in, or someone who's as a teenager, and then someone in their 20s, you see that there is more fine-tuning of the architecture of those connections. So again, to sum up, the brain and different regions of the brain is responsible for coordinating all actions of the body. It's responsible for processing information coming from inside the body, but also outside the body.
And so what are the major parts of the brain that are impacted by trauma and stress?
Great question. So one could argue that, well, every part of the brain, but the ones that we have a lot of information about and we have delineated the mechanism is going to be the prefrontal cortex. So that's the part of the brain that allows me to solve a linear equation problem. We have the part of the brain, the one that's tucked in the middle, the limbic system, that I'm going to come back to. And that's the emotional brain, and also the brain stem, which deals with our fight or flight. Now, if you look at the limbic system is composed of many structures. And one structure that's so critical is the amygdala. And the amygdala is a double structure that does what? It receives information from the rest of the body, from the outside, and it processes that information, and it's asking the question, safe, not safe. So when there is an input that the brain interprets as something that is risk, not safe, punishment, the amygdala will become overactive. And that overactivity will do what? It's going to send information to the brainstem and say, wake up, alarm, alert, and it's going to actually prevent information from going to the prefrontal cortex, because who cares about solving an algebra problem when you are under alert?
So does that mean that then children, youth, adults then are not able to learn or are not able to process information during those times?
So that's a great distinction, able to learn versus process information. So look at it from an evolutionary perspective or from a cost-benefit analysis. The brain's only job is to keep us alive. And then it does other things, but the most important job, if it receives information that there is a threat out there, the brain is going to allocate all the resources in the brain, in the body, to keep us alive. Now, what that does, we know that literally information, sensory information, is prevented from going to the prefrontal cortex. So it's not that there is a permanent damage and we can't learn, it's that we can't process the information, allocate energy to learn.
Does that also affect our memories?
It does. And so I'm sure you've had an experience where you're under a lot of stress and you feel, maybe you feel like fogginess or you can't remember, right? And in those cases, what's happening, again, we have finite energy. And that energy is focused on resolving the stress.
So kind of in my own readings about trauma and how it affects the brain and things, I've come across this term that is defined by people in different ways, but it's the biological alarm system. Can you sort of explain what that is and what utility it has?
Yeah. So like any system, any intelligent system, I want to have backup mechanisms. If there is a threat, for that backup mechanism to become active and either self-correct or protect from that threat. So we have a series of structures in the brain, the amygdala is one of them, that are doing comparison. So I have information that come into the brain, and the comparison is, do I remember anything similar to this information? Or is this a threat? So doing cost-benefit analysis. And when the outcome is, this is not safe, regardless of whether it actually is or not, it's the interpretation. When that interpretation is that it's not safe, the activity of those cells will go up. They will trigger a series of events. So what does that mean? They're going to cause certain hormones, certain chemicals to be released. They activate what we call the fight or flight response. So this fight or flight response, this is a biological reaction. It's ubiquitous, we all have it, and it's a really important and beautiful mechanism. It keeps us alive. The problem is when that mechanism is active for a long time, right? Now, why is that? It uses a lot of energy. It depletes us of energy.
So ultimately, it can, right? It serves a protective purpose. It can help an individual, but over time, and if too many chemicals are released, right, then it has the potential to harm someone.
Absolutely.
So how do we know when it's to a toxic level or
Yes.
that it's causing so much harm?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I love what you said, that it has benefit. And Gabor Mate, among others, have talked about the wisdom of trauma. So when we experience these things and the body goes into fight or flight, it's trying to protect us. But as you asked, importantly, how do we, when is stress good and when does it become toxic? If you look at the stress response, so this biological clock is now active and it causes a series of chemicals to be released. They don't release locally, they release systemically, meaning they go into the blood. And let's, for example, look at cortisol. Cortisol is a really powerful chemical. It goes into the blood and it reaches every organ system. So while it's going to tell our muscles to get ready to run, it's also going to tell our immune system to quiet down. And so a prolonged exposure to cortisol, it can wreak havoc on our different organ system, weaken our immune system. It can also impact our cardiovascular system. Importantly, it can hinder our ability to learn.
So a healthy brain responds to stress in a healthy way, or how does it respond to stress? And how is that different from a brain that's experienced trauma?
Yeah. So a healthy brain, a brain that can cope. So stress is a challenge that's presented to the brain. The brain needs to resolve it. And a healthy brain is one that's able to cope, that's able to differentiate between an imminent threat versus something that I could worry about later. A healthy brain is able to, or someone that's learned these regulatory mechanisms, they're able to recognize when they are in fight or flight and then incorporate strategies to calm themselves down. On the other hand, a traumatic brain, or a brain that has experienced various forms of trauma, that brain might already be in fight or flight. And then there is an added spike of cortisol, and then there is another one. And so what could happen is you could just be stuck in a perpetual state of fight or flight. Imagine a child walking around with the alarm going on all the time. So everything becomes a potential threat. They are hyper vigilant, they are irritable, or sometimes maybe they are disconnected, they don't interact. So it is an unhealthy way to exist.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, like I know I work with children and I know many of the people taking this class do too. And so you said that, what are some of the trauma responses that youth might have? What are some of these characteristics? You mentioned irritable.
Yeah, so there are a variety of behaviors that is exhibited. And what I often say is look at it from the perspective of the brain. The brain is trying to protect us. And so I may look at a child and say, oh, that child is being manipulative. And that is my perspective, and that perspective doesn't take into account what happened, what experiences. But if I put a trauma lens on, I go from that child is being manipulative to the child is doing whatever it takes to survive. Another one that I often see with not just children, or I see it with adults, is that there's this feeling of lack of motivation, unmotivated or lazy. And that's a perspective that, again, without a trauma lens, what would happen is, oh, the child is just lazy, the child is just unmotivated. And in reality, when we put a trauma lens on, the perspective shifts to perhaps the child is feeling depressed and there is literally no energy for them to do what you're asking them to do, depressed or overwhelmed. So it's really important to, for example, we may see that a lot of children take risk. And that's something actually that's natural for children and youth. But we see it more with children that have experienced adversities. And we may say, oh, that's a bad move, or we judge it and say that's not smart, and so on. But again, putting a trauma lens on does what? Helps us look at a perspective, a bigger perspective.
Interesting. So I kind of wanted to bring us back to context. And I know earlier you shared that you're a refugee. And so I'm just sort of wondering, what role does culture play on an individual's stress response?
Yeah, so it's a really great question. So there are multiple confounding factors. It's not a linear, I experience something or something happens and I experience it. It's important to take the cultural context, the historical context, because they impact how I experience it, how I talk about it. So for example, for me, as a scientist, we know that it's really important to acknowledge the emotions. If I'm going to work with my trauma, it's really important to say, I'm in pain, or I am angry, but on the other hand, I come from a culture that what I learned as a refugee is to be grateful, always be grateful. So there's always, if I want to say I'm struggling, I'm overwhelmed, there's always in the background, well, I survived, I could have been dead, I should be grateful. So while gratitude is so important, when gratitude is not congruent with the situation you're in, it actually can have a negative impact. You're suppressing your emotions. So culture plays a really important role in how we experience the event, but also how we deal with the aftermath.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Dr. Mays, for sharing your own personal experience and your own expertise on this really important information for our coaches, other non-professional educators, and folks viewing this class.
Thank you, Susan.
That concludes our discussion of the body's stress response system and how we can identify specific triggers and reactions to trauma. In our next lesson, we will dive deeper into the specific youth behaviors you may encounter when interacting with children affected by trauma. Thank you for joining us again, and we look forward to continuing with you soon.